Welcome to this, the fifth in a series of conversations in the spirit of Elizabeth Palmer Peabody and Margaret Fuller Ossoli. These are ongoing conversations led by myself, Deborah Pope Lance, and as well the Reverend Gail Seavey. They grew out of the Berry Street essays that both Gail and I gave. Gail's essay, If Our Secrets Define Us, called for an end to secrecy and a need for transparency in addressing the individual and institutional wounds caused by ministerial abuses of power and authority. And my essay, Whence We Come and How and Whither, called attention to our failure to come to consensus about clergy ethics or to respond resolutely to ethical breaches and to allow clergy misconduct to continue to harm individuals, threaten the viability of our congregations, and sully the public trust in religious leadership. Gail and I and our guests are recording this interview and conversation on April 6th, 2017 on Zoom after a particularly difficult and noticeably challenging week in the Unitarian Universalist universe. We are having this particular conversation because after Gail's Berry Street, there appeared in front of her podium a link of mostly female-identified ministers, mostly under 35 years of age, and some genderqueer colleagues who encircled her podium. And a lot of people ever since have wondered what that was about. So we have with us as guests today two of the young ministers who were in that circle. We have the Reverend Darcy Baxter, who is minister of the UU Church in Modesto, California. Hi, Darcy.
Hello.
And we have Ashley Horan, who is the executive director of Moose. Help me out with this, Ashley.
If you want the gestures, it's Moose Jaw.
Yeah, Moose Jaw, which is, for those in the home audience, the Minnesota Unitarian Universalist Social Justice Alliance, of which she is the executive director. Welcome, Darcy and Ashley. So, tell us how did this circle come to be, and what was it about?
Yeah, I'll start because I think came from me. I was in the audience at the Berry Street lecture, and in particular, just the experience of being in a place where a person with a big pulpit named names about folks who had abused our trust, who had abused other people, and spoke so directly of wrongs that had been done without talking around them in a way that felt constrained by a bureaucracy or shackled in some way by a consideration for what we should and shouldn't say publicly.
You're speaking, of course, that in Gail Seavey's essay, she actually said the names of ministers who had engaged in clergy sexual misconduct, and shamelessly did that. No one had ever done that before.
Right. And what I experienced at that moment was a shift in myself, and that act on Gail's behalf was permission granting to me. And it moved things from, I often have this experience in some of the Facebook affinity groups that I'm part of. Like, I'm in a 20s and 30s UU women ministers group, or other spaces where I share identity with people. And I find that often it's in those spaces that we're discussing things that happen to young ministers or to women ministers or whatever, and that I'm often frustrated by that because it feels like we're not actually the people who need to learn these lessons, right? Just like, you know, this needs to be heard by the folks who are causing the harm. And of course, this extends to any number of affinity groups, right? I mean, like, but the way that any supremacy culture work, whether it's white supremacy or a patriarchy or whatever, is that it tells you that you don't have a right to name those things out loud in front of people who are perpetrators and in front of people who are invested in keeping the system intact.
So you don't have the power or the privilege to do that.
Right. And so there was just this powerful shift that happened in me of saying, oh my God, you can do this. Mm-hmm. And I was not unaware of the fact that Gail was taking such a huge risk in doing this publicly. You could feel it in the room, right? There were, I mean, shockwaves going through because this is not how we do things. Yep. And in that moment, so my job is that I'm, of course, a clergy person, but I'm also an organizer. I run a state advocacy organization. And my immediate impulse when I feel like something powerful is happening and that there needs to be an affirmation that truth is being told in the face of power that would keep it silent. I know from being in protests, I know from my friends of color, I know from my trans friends that people are literally safer when there are more people, right? It is much harder to perpetuate cultures of oppression against a large group of people than there is against one person. And so my immediate impulse was I literally composed a Facebook message to folks that I knew in the room. So it was, as you said, Deb, you know, largely young ministers, largely women identified and genderqueer folks. And I can literally read you the Facebook message. I called it up.
Yeah, do.
I said, beloveds, if you are in the room and would like to join me in thanking and blessing Gail for her truth-telling this afternoon, will you join me in the back of the room as she's wrapping up and applause is starting, and we will walk forward together and join hands in front of her, forming a chain of gratitude and blessing. Please forward to others in the room. So I sent that to, I don't know, 20 people who I knew, and then other folks forwarded it on.
Because there are many more than 20 people. There may have been twice that or more. Yeah. And then other people who I know you didn't send the Facebook pages to because they weren't under 35.
Well, and I probably didn't just send it to people who are 35 and under, but just, you know, my immediate group of folks are folks who are, you know, share some identities with me. So,
well, there were some people who didn't even know what it was,
right?
Who got up from the first row. And, you know, there were people, some of them who were Berry Street essay people, or, you know, former essayists or on the committee or related to one of the speakers that preceded Gail. All, you know, they got up and joined the line. Yeah. They didn't even know what it was about. So they were empowered to do that in solidarity to what they imagined it was.
Yeah. And I mean, the initial impulse was just, you know, Gail, it was gratitude for you and what you had done in that space. And also a deep need to feel connected to the other people literally beside me who felt that same gratitude in a space that felt in many ways very hostile to what you had brought. And it was in some ways, I'm going to just say this and you can censor it later if you want to, but it was a big fuck you to all the people who were murmuring and saying, she can't do that, blah, blah, you know, and in the moment perpetuating exactly what she was talking about not doing, right? And I think all of us who went up there, whether or not they were part of that initial chain or whatever the intentions of the multiple people was, it was this sense of we're together in this and we are not alone in this big room and we're not going to let this go on the shoulders of one person who's taken this risk. Wow.
Thank you. There were some people who actually thought it was a protest, and they were quickly disabused.
Direct action will always be misconstrued.
That's right. What was it like for you, Darcy? Tell us about your.
Well, it's really, so So I want to give some, it's interesting that, right, the way these stories connect. Ashley and I first met each other. We did our internships in the same geographic area. And during my internship year, I was in a congregation that was in the process of unearthing egregious sexual misconduct from a previously serving minister a ways back.
Mm-hmm.
And that played out in the system in some very painful ways. So when I was sitting there, and I had actually heard ahead of time that Gail was likely to name names through my own network. So I sat in there.
Hoping I knew one you knew.
So I kind of knew actually what was going to happen. Like I had an idea of what was going to happen. And particularly since that internship experience, which, you know, I'm a third generation UU, that experience opened up this history of misconduct and boundary violations that just breaks my heart. I was raised in this UU tradition. Like it was a safe space as a young woman, as a queer person. Like, you know, it shifted my understanding of our tradition in a way that like broke my heart. You know, I have this chalice necklace, like many of us do, that my dad bought me in the social hall when I was in 4th grade, and I still wear it. You know, and after that internship, I did not wear that necklace for at least a year. Like it was just really, really painful. Mm-hmm. So I was sitting in there with a friend and colleague, having some idea what was going to happen. And I just sat there, and I remember just the emotional experience of being in that room. Like I'm trying to convey what it was like. It was thick with emotion. I had tears streaming down my face, just some sense of empathy, and also profound heartbreak that this is how many times we have missed the mark. And there's who we say we are and the ways we have just fallen short and short and short. Just so painful. So it was just a deeply emotional experience. And what's kind of embarrassing is I didn't see the message from Ashley. My friend and colleague she had to go. So she got up. So it was like sitting alone. I was like, well, screw this. I don't want to sit this alone. And I quickly look around and I see Ashley standing in the back. No idea about the message, hadn't seen the message yet. So I walked back there just to stand with Ashley, and Ashley, you were talking about this impulse like to be together and not be alone. And then after you ended your talk, all of a sudden we started moving forward. And you know, for me, there's this, you know, because the emotionality of it all, it was just like, what's going on? And then like, I'm going because the people who had come up, these were the people I knew.
These are my people. Yeah. You're right.
Yeah. So I don't exactly know what's about to go down. I mean, you know, I kind of pieced it together, but there was this like, what, we're moving? And then it was like, yes, we are moving. And we were together. And, again, that sense of gratitude, but there were tears streaming down my face, and I caught eyes of like friends and colleagues, because it was, you know, just again trying to the emotional experience and just the energy that was in that room, and just to stand there, and it was also really profoundly healing, because there were times I felt really silenced, you know, as I went through, you know, in my formation process. And, you know, Ashley, you were talking about like the ways that we're not supposed to talk about, like we're taught, you know, we stay in our affinity groups, we're not supposed to say the things to those in power. But right, and you also mentioned the risk Gail took. It's that in order to speak up, you bear incredible personal risk, because a system will lash out at the person who is being a kind of whistleblower, right? These are dynamics we know about in organization. Right. And just that it is risky. And
that's what we're seeing. Like, I mean, I have to bring it back to this national conversation right now, right? Is that there are people of color who are naming the realities that they have known, right? Yep. And have experienced and have been told that they're crazy, have been told that they're wrong, yep. Just like young women have, just like survivors of abuse have. You know, obviously the contexts are different, but like, you know, the backlash is unbelievable, right? Like, it's so divisive to say these things. You're tearing us apart. You're not honoring
hysteria.
Self-righteousness, right?
How could someone in that position, right? I think it's these dynamics that are, you know, all these kinds of power dynamics. It's this culture of surprise. And I always struggle with, there are books now, right? Like there are books that predict you know, A, B, C, D, what's going to happen with these
Yes.
dynamics. And yet there's this like, oh my gosh, I can't believe this is happening, you know?
Right.
And
That there will be a response that attempts to silence and bring things back, you know, put everybody back on their seats, so to speak,
Right.
with a kind of patriarchal decorum
yeah,
that
but
that will somehow put a lid on this inappropriate moment.
there's a deep irony because the ways that you use value science, and it's interesting to me that in the field of science, when you look at trauma studies and trauma theory, and there's actually a body of science that is a source of right truth that you share and turn to, and yet we're ignoring this huge body of knowledge that reveals insight and could guide us into what lays ahead as we discuss sexual misconduct, as we talk about, white supremacy. There are tools that are right there, and I see them, like they're right there. And this is part of the confusion of systems where there's been abuse and violations and wrongful power, is there's that confusion where it's like, it's right here. Like there's this book right here. And like, what, like what, just confused as to why that link, we don't make the links.
Well, and one of the links I'm just going to like throw out here, because we can't talk about it within the four walls of our subject today, is that there are books about after pastors, right? And the kind of upset and chaos and disorder that they have to deal with. And often they get early resignations or negotiated departures or controversies that kind of erupt from nowhere, like exploding elephants in the room. And I wonder about that around Peter Morales, about whether or not he's an after pastor. So, Gail, you were, I'm just throwing that away. Gail, you were kind of getting animated. Do you have something to ask Darcy or Ashley?
It's clear to me, I mean, we know the answer of why they're confused and aren't looking at the science. I mean, because it means we have to look at ourselves and have to look inside and the effects of trauma on all of us. And as I said in the essay, but I see it every day in terms of the response I get, it means that the people who are at the top of the hierarchy or above anybody in that complex hierarchical system have to admit their vulnerability. And we got a lot of people defending their vulnerability. And
so it's denial in the service of lowering their anxiety, because they too have experienced trauma. And
some of them have experienced trauma, and some of them, everyone has experienced vulnerability. And if we, so if you got, you've got the triangle, and you've got the people that are supported and crushing other people in this complex thing, and for them to fall means they have to admit that they are a full human being. And so I see a lot of people really trying hard not to be totally human. And it's so ironic, because of course the only way they can be not totally human is for us to hold them up. And so just last week, I've just seen, I feel like finally, that this pyramid is starting to collapse. And of course that's painful. It's like all these stones are starting to roll and people are getting hurt and bumped, and it's very painful for everybody. But it's not until we're all like on that same flat ground that we're going to be able to figure this out. And so that confusion in the moment of everything, that's the image that came to me, Darcy, was just seeing this pile, this pyramid, classic hierarchy pyramid, a rock just, and what was great when you guys came forward for me was this visual image of these incredible leaders all spread out, holding hands in that circle on that horizontal level. That power of that image for me of, you know, this is who we could be. This is who we are.
Mm-hmm.
A lot. We're not all down there in that circle yet, but it was so powerful. And, you know, for me, I really felt like, I mean, I wrote this, that I used to be an artist, and I used to make these, we decided they were moon goddesses at some point, but these porcelain things, and people would buy them, and they were beautiful and angry looking, and people would return them. And people never kept them. They were so upsetting to people. And like one lady told me years later, well, I had to return it because I would have gotten divorced then. And I did eventually get divorced, but I guess I wasn't ready. I mean, stuff like that. So
do you have any more of them left anywhere?
I got pictures. A lot of them are broken.
I want one.
They were clay. I'll show you. Oh yeah, I'll show you. I got it in Gloucester. I'll show you. So, but what I'm saying is, I felt like I felt like up there that was possessed by this moon goddess, that I was up there, because I usually talk really fast, and I slowed way down. So it was, but it, you know, when people talk about channeling, I don't believe I'm channeling some moon. I was channeling all of you. I was channeling that emotion and energy that you guys were talking about in the room. And it was there. It was you. And it wasn't until you stood up in front that I could actually be back and just be myself.
You actually conjured them. They like came.
No, but your energy, we all feel that. I mean,
yeah, really. No, I
love that. We love that buzz. But boy, it was the best buzz ever. And so it wasn't until, I mean, I just realized as you were talking, it wasn't until you were all up there and I looked at you all down there that I could let that go and just be me again. And I just burst out into tears and sat down. I had the whole lieutenant, you know, but you know, it's like I could just be my vulnerable human self again and just me, which was great.
Yeah,
it was great both.
Yeah, one of the things I just think about, like, you know, white supremacy culture, what it means to be white, and our waspiness, right? Just our affective cultures about how we're supposed to be with emotion or not have emotion.
Yeah.
And one of the things that struck me about when you spoke was the emotion. Like at times I read you as actually being like triggered, even like that the emotion was just so present.
Yeah.
How countercultural or breaking the rules that was, and sharing that emotion with a whole, you know, with people that as a UU culture, I don't think is very affectively wise.
No, and it took me 20 years of being a minister before I had the courage and the self-confidence to be fully present in my whole body, which means your emotions are there in public. But I slowly built up to it. So, you know, when you were saying at the beginning, it was before we were talking, so offline, we were making jokes about, and I hope you don't mind if I report some, because they were great, looking good as a tool for the revolution. You know, women spend, and queer, gender, you know, actually a lot of people now in leadership spend a lot of time thinking about presentation, how they look as a tool for communication. It is a tool for communication.
It's 85% of all communication is nonverbals and
right. And so I even wrote in my because all of my dissertation work was on how women looking at images of women as well as at each other, how that affects their theology and what that means for them. And I always challenged myself, and I see all of you doing this too, to be fully present in my body as I am in every way. So yes, I'm a WASP, I'm a woman, I'm a mother, I'm a wife, I'm an artist, I'm a lover, I'm all those things that I am, and just be fully present and visually show that. It was an art form, but in that moment, it communicated. So I felt like
they
it was total communication.
They embodied the circle of young women and genderqueer and female identified ministers, kind of embodied what you had just delivered.
It embodied that and a hope that what I saw there was our hope. That's what I hope we become. Not, this diverse, very alive, very compassionate, very connected, horizontally organized group. You to see it, the power of it was incredible.
I also want to just note that the massacre at the Pulse nightclub had happened just prior to Ministry Days. And those of us who are queer identified, and particularly our queer colleagues of color, were in incredible pain because of that. We had conversations the previous night in a collegial conversation for queer folks. I would be willing to bet that more than half of the folks who came forward in that circle of young, largely female identified genderqueer folks were also queer identified or genderqueer. And I think there is a deep connection between this understanding that those of us who have vulnerable identities, that our vulnerability is magnified the more of those identities which we occupy. And that I think there is a visceral feeling, an embodied feeling of a need for safety and connection in that room. And you speaking to these really sort of vulnerable things that many of us had, either experienced in our congregational lives or our ministries, or in our personal lives, I think accentuated that even more. And so it's complicated. It's complicated.
Well, but what you're bringing up is that this is about life and death.
Yep.
So I know and this is just for my identification, that as a woman, when I first got up there to speak in public, my mother cried because she was sure I was going to get killed. That women are beat up, they're murdered, they're raped for being up there, for speaking up. That is hardwired in our culture. So you guys, we're the bearers of the vulnerability for these men or women who then identify with being on top of the hierarchy. We're the pain bearers in the system for their lack of ability to bear their vulnerability, which I'm sure is true of the guy who went in there and killed the people in the Pulse Club.
Right.
He could not bear, as a man, his vulnerability, which probably was that he too is queer. Who knows, So, I don't mean to psychoanalyze this. I really don't. For me,
no, but I can give you a graphic example of that because, you named me in your essay 10 times, my having given one previously, which was, put me into a very vulnerable place within the association. And it was later, it was the next day, it felt a little dangerous. It felt a little redemptive. It felt a little lacking in humility. I had to wrestle with, oh my goodness, bad things are going to come because she's said my name 10 times, right? And the next day, a retired colleague who's known me a long time, and who is just a gem of a man, I went over to say hi, because I hadn't seen him in a long time because he's retired. And all he could say to me was, "They didn't kill you, Deborah. You're not dead. You survived. They didn't do you in." And I'm like, all I could do is like weep because he named it. He named that I hadn't died, because it really is about life and death. When women, when genderqueer, when African American ministers of color, begin to start naming the abuse and the and bias, and the patriarchy and the white supremacy, that is dangerous. But what we need really, and I think that's part of what the circle was about, was all this stuff is of a piece, and all of it really demands a power analysis if we're going to really change our world. What are you thinking about power, Ashley and Darcy? Is that something?
No, maybe a little bit. No.
Take it away, sister colleague.
I mean, everything. I'm thinking about the wisdom that when we're discussing these dynamics, and I feel like a lot of it is rooted. We're talking about like the disruption of women and white women entering into UU ministry. And Gail, you're talking about the dynamics of the projected vulnerability and projected shame, and right, that's and then it happens to women.
That's right.
Color, right? Like it's. I think it's interesting to me how when we're talking about the events of this past week.
Yes, parallel.
We don't connect the dots. That it's the way power operates, and there's nuances and differences, but there is a fundamental analysis that we share, and there's wisdom that I think about. Maybe some folks, some of our elder wise women colleagues that how their analysis and experience could be then applied to some of the dynamics coming up when we're articulating about race. But we're talking about, how power operates in bodies, how it operates through emotional fields, and, just all this, the way, this subtle stuff. And I think I really give thanks for a lot of stuff of neuroscience, because I think it's the way you use can approach embodiment without having to talk about the spirit or other kinds of language that can be invoked. But to be really honest about how, how do we negotiate power, and also how scary it is, and the uneven risk. I'm curious, Ashley, for you, like even being the organizer of the circle, like did you at all, like to me, I was like, thank God, that was a ballsy move, right? I mean, and you're even coming out now as being an organizer of that. Mm-hmm. And, thinking about how power operates within UUism, you often need a mentor or elder colleague who can bestow power on you and who can make the hookups. Like, how are you relating to coming out? Like, you're like, yeah, I organized this in a system that can be pretty hostile to naming these dynamics.
Yeah, I mean, in many ways, I don't experience the same sense of vulnerability or risk as many of our colleagues do. I'm an extrovert. I've got a lot of connections. I'm white. I'm a big-bodied person. I get taken seriously where I go, and so I don't have to worry quite so much about what it looks like for me to do something like that. I also, I serve not in a congregation. I serve not as an associate minister. And so my actual position is less at risk.
Yeah, and it insulates you from some of the routine channels of silencing. And I mean, I've spent the last 20 years in community ministry, self-employed, and feel like that has protected me as it protects you now.
Yep.
I am so sorry. We are out of time. I think that we need to schedule, Gail, another one on power and all the, sexism, racism, heterosexism, white supremacy, and the relationships to power. But we're done for today. And I think, I'm sorry, Gail, do you have a last word?
I can't thank the two of you enough for joining us in this conversation. You give me such faith.
Yes, and hope for the future of our ministry. So we say goodbye here with the Reverend Darcy Baxter and the Reverend Ashley Horan and the Reverend Gail Seavey. I sign off to you and look forward to future conversations. This is the Reverend Deborah Pope Lance.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye, everybody.